Hi guys, today we are talking a little bit more in depth about immigration. And so you'll find the text information, a little bit more detail on immigration policies in Canada. So I encourage you to visit the text information to supplement this lesson. Just make sure I can get to my next slide here. Hold on, I'm having slide technical difficulties. All right. So in the PowerPoint lesson for today, make sure that you watch this video. So as well, you're going to want to take some time to go through each one of these videos. It's going to give you a little background history on Canada as a country. So it's a little mini history lesson on how immigrants came in from Europe into Canada and how they settled the land, as well as how Asian immigrants had come in from the western side of Canada to contribute towards the expansion of Canada's railroad system. And the kind of like the experience of an immigrant, what it was like for early immigrants to Canada as they came in, historically speaking. So Canada is a very diverse population, and we have had many people come into Canada since its onset. So remember that Canada became an official country, autonomous from England in 1867, when we had what was called Confederation and started the Confederation of Provinces in Canada. And during that time period, there weren't very many people that were coming into the country. There were either Aboriginal groups that were originally here in Canada, or they were Europeans that had settled the colonized areas, mostly just French and British colonizers. And then over the late 1800 period, we see an increase of people coming in because the economy got stronger. And this is because of the Industrial Revolution. So in our last lesson, we talked about the impact of the Industrial Revolution, the mechanization of things like cars and the steam engine, trains, transportation. Transportation across Canada was a big thing. So we have the Canadian National Railroad and the Canadian Pacific Railroad, coming from both the western side to towards the east, and then the eastern side towards the west, kind of meeting in the middle. And running those railroad tracks across Canada really impacted the ability to move goods and move people. And this meant that more of the land could be settled, so more people wanted to move into Canada during this time period. We have a really sharp spike that we see at the beginning of the 1900s because of the Canadian Gold Rush. The Yukon Gold Rush was huge. We had a lot of people that wanted to expand, and Canada opened up massive pieces of the middle of Canada for farmland and sold off massive pieces of farmland for very, very little to attract more people to come into the country. We needed to populate the country. So Canada opened up its borders and started offering all that Midwestern land to whoever wanted to come over, could basically get land for very, very low cost. One story that I was looking at was that a parcel of 100 hectares, so not acres, but hectares of land, which is very, very large pieces of land, which is basically bigger than the size of most of our regional city sizes, were being offered to immigrants to come in and settle for a Canadian dollar. So you could spend $1 Canadian at the time and get 100 hectares of land for $1 Canadian. This would be like a parcel of land bigger than the city of Regina, Saskatchewan, for $1. And so that's why you see such incredible expansion west in Canada, and the spike around that 1910 time period is just that Western movement, the gold rush, and the advancement of agriculture land being sold to immigrants coming in and wanting to move to those areas. And then all of a sudden you see this like dip at the time periods where we had war. So we have the 1920s, pre-1920s, we have World War I. And so we did not have a lot of immigrants coming in from Europe into Canada during this time period because there was war in Europe. World War I was ravaging France in particular, and England and the French were battling against Germany at the time. And so there was a massive 4-year-long First World War, or the Great War during during this time period. Then we had this 1920s roaring 20s time period, and then it led us into the Great Depression. And so we have this boom that leads then to bust, and you really see that there's a very low immigration rate during the Great Depression era leading into World War II. During World War II, again, very low immigration during any wartime. But then post World War II, we had a massive immigration of European immigrants into Canada, as well as we see a spike in immigrants from Asia coming in. And that's actually the spike that you see between the 1950s and 1960s. The highest spike is actually Asian immigrants coming into the western areas of British Columbia during this time period, because Canada opened up its borders to Chinese citizens during this time period. Then the 1960s, we had a lower economic time, so we have lower immigration during this time. And then you see frequent spikes from here. Whenever there's a good economic time, we have high immigration. But whenever there's conflict in other areas of the world, we also see times of spike in immigration, because after the 1960s, Canada opened its immigration policies up, and we became more of a humanitarian country, offering more support to people who were refugees or who were asylum seekers who wanted to come into Canada to be protected from whatever was going on in their world. So poor economic times, again, you see it go down, but you can see overall between the 1980s and 1990s, overall, immigration was quite high. And that's because of the humanitarian efforts and open immigration policies that Canada started to become very popular for in the world. So we are the leading UN nation that has the most open immigration policies of any other country in the world. And that still holds. Today, we are still the leading UN nation with open immigration policies. And we can see just continued periods of immigration heightening since the 1990s, since we redid our constitution. So Canada's constitution was rewritten, and now our constitution resembles the human rights document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And our new Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is very specific to offering freedom and mobility rights and freedoms to anyone who lives in our country. And so therefore we have definitely been a top country that people want to come into, especially if they're refugees or asylum seekers. And we also have lots of jobs, and we have lots of land, and we have good government. So there's a lot of pull factors pulling people into Canada. So here's a table that shows the growth of immigration. What are the top countries and in order that have come into Canada during different time periods. So you can see that between the 1900s to 1920s, most of the immigrants coming into Canada were European. I do want to highlight that China is the only country in that list, and that was particularly because Chinese were allowed in as workers in the West to help with the industrialization practices and the railroad, continuing to lay railroad foundations and transportation across Canada. And we had a very specific group of people that we were allowing into Canada, and we gave visas in larger numbers to Chinese citizens. That's why you see such a large number of people coming in from China. Then in 1965, you continue to see China on that list. You see other countries like the Caribbean, island countries in the Caribbean, and a lot of Eastern European countries as well. And United States is always high on the list of immigrants just because of that neighboring countries that that border, the only country that borders Canada. Being a neighbor, we have a more fluid immigration policy with the USA. And up to 2012, notice that China is very high on the list and has that asterisk, actually showing that there's a shift from European immigrants to mostly Asian immigrants coming in from Asia. Haiti being a really high number because of conflict in the country and natural disaster. And we had a growth in our partnership with industry partnerships with South Korea, particularly around the automotive industry. So you see a lot of jobs that actually got relocated from South Korea to Canada. And so we have a lot of Korean car companies like Hyundai and Kia, for example, that started to have their manufacturing in Canada. And we had huge numbers of South Koreans that were coming in on job visas into Canada during that time. Currently, what do our current immigration rates look like? We have some more countries in the last 8 years that would appear in this list. Syrian refugees. We have taken in more than 10,000 immigrants from just Syria alone. So they would be very high on this list as well. So how does somebody become an immigrant into Canada? There's different processes that they can come through. All of them have to go through an application process, and application processes take less time or more time depending on what you're applying for. So the different categories are family class. So if somebody marries a Canadian, they can come in and become a permanent resident of Canada and an immigrant to Canada. That is what I did. I married a Canadian, so I had to file for family class, and that's an application process that, depending on how things are in our country, it can take as little as 6 months, it can take as much as 3 years. But usually it's faster if somebody is directly married to a Canadian citizen. You can also sponsor someone under family class if you are a different family member, like a parent or cousins, things like that. If you have some type of family relative that you want to bring into Canada, a Canadian citizen can do that and sponsor them to come into Canada if they have Canadian citizenship. If you are an immigrant like me, I'm a permanent resident and immigrant to Canada. I'm not a Canadian citizen, but I've been living here now for almost 20 years. And so because I've been living here for so long, I now can sponsor my family members to come into Canada through the family class as well. So I could have my mother, who's an American living over in Buffalo, I could sponsor her to come into Canada now. Even though I'm not a citizen, I've lived here long enough. I believe the statute of limitations is 15 years. If you've lived in Canada for more than 15 years, then you're considered like a citizen when it comes to your ability to sponsor family members to come in. Economic class would be workers. If you have a job or want a job here in Canada, you can come in and get a visa, an employment visa. And if your company is stationed there, like I was just mentioning South Korea, for example, if your company is permanently stationed in Canada, then you as a worker working for that company can come and permanently immigrate and stay with that company. Sometimes Canadian jobs are given to workers from around the world for certain reasons, and they can come in as immigrants for that economic class for longer periods of time than just temporary work visas. The other category is asylum seekers or refugee status. And this is more of an emergency type status where people are trying to flee their country or situation and gain access to the rights and freedoms that we have here in Canada to protect them. There might be other special circumstances that people face. And so there's one case study that kind of fits into this other situation, which is people who have been convicted of crimes and are being imprisoned in countries around the world where their human rights might be being violated. They might be extradited, or they might be allowed to actually apply to come to Canada and serve out their prison sentences they might be able to be extradited from where they are and where they've been convicted to come to Canada to serve out their prison sentences in Canada fully. So for example, the United States has different laws state to state about how prisoners are kept and punished. So some states in the US don't have death penalties, but some states in the US still do have death penalties. So for example, Texas is one of those states that still has what's called lethal injection. So if somebody is convicted of murder, the crime of murder, and they have a death penalty sentence like lethal injection, and a person can file for extradition to Canada as an American citizen, being convicted of this crime, facing the death penalty. If they want to escape the death penalty, they can apply to Canada to be moved as a prisoner into a Canadian prison and serve out a life sentence for the rest of their life in a Canadian prison. This is a highly controversial tactic. It's something that if you're interested in this topic, you should take the law courses, our grade 11 and grade 12 law courses, because we get into this topic of, is it right? Is it right for a country like Canada to do something like this when citizens of other countries have committed crimes? Should they serve their crime out in their own country? Canada's position is a position called a peace position. And because we are human rights honoring peace position country, we want to honor all of the Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations human rights document. And part of that is that we believe that we could be a country where people could seek asylum even from their justice system. So Canada's position is that the United States and Texas exacting death penalties on prisoners is a violation of their human rights. And so we would offer to extend a hand to that person to protect their human rights by offering them to serve out their prison sentence here. There are many prisons around the world where people are being beaten and tortured and their living conditions are awful. And so for those circumstances, it seems to be a no-brainer that Canada would be a country where we could say that we would rescue people from being tortured in prisons around the world. But in the situation with Texas, these prisoners are being, they're being prosecuted and put to death. And so Canada's position is that we should honor their life and allow them their right to life as stated in the human rights document. So this is a highly controversial topic when it comes to immigration. Is it right? Should Canada continue to do this? Our prison systems here in Canada are funded by our taxes, so that means taxpayers are paying for the food and shelter and care and education and healthcare of prisoners in our prison system. So should this continue to happen as part of our immigration policies? Is it right? Is it wrong? I'll leave that up to you, but that's something controversial for you to consider. So of those classes, of those 4 classes, how many people are coming into Canada underneath these 4 classes? I said I came in under the family class, so it's only about 25% of the immigration into Canada is coming in through some type of family class status. But notice how large the economic class status is. The majority of people coming into Canada are coming in for jobs. Most of them are Americans or Asians, and so they're coming in from the United States or from Mexico or from countries in Asia, particularly China and South Korea, to come in and work in jobs within the Canadian markets. And maybe they're coming in and permanently living in Canada and eventually becoming citizens, but the majority are actually immigrants who come in, much like yourself as students. At NCC, we have international students that come in for an education in Canada. And when they graduate university, they end up in internships and jobs that stay in Canada. So they are immigrants that have come in for an education, and then they end up staying for economic class status, where they have a job in Canada that they then have, where they stay immigrants. They don't become Canadian citizens, but they remain as immigrants long-term in the workforce for under the economic class. So we do need lots of workers. Canada has a very low population. So seeing that we have so many people immigrating in to come in for jobs is a good thing. And then you can see the refugee and asylum class, and then that other class, other category being much smaller. So take a time out from this video and watch this video link right now. So on this slide, you see an example of a temporary travel visa. Most of the time when somebody comes into Canada, they have to have a temporary visa that they can come in with first. You can come in as a temporary visitor for 6 months, up to 6 months. You can come in and work under a temporary employment visa if you meet the right requirements and your employer can prove that there's no one else in Canada that can do that job. You can come into Canada as a temporary worker. We have things like migrant workers that come in only for a growing season to help pick the grapes in Niagara-on-the-Lake and pick the fruit and work in the nurseries and things. And that is a common way that people come into Canada, is through their job, that maybe they come in temporarily through a visa first. and then they apply for status while they're here or in the process of the times that they come in for work. And then there are also visas granted for more permanent residency through those statuses that we just talked about. So most of them, you saw 65% are actually coming in through work visas. And then there's the refugee and asylum seekers, and then there's also the family class. And so this is what they would get first. They would get a visa temporarily first, and then they would have to apply for residency status through an application process. So stop the video here and watch this link that shows the refugee and how refugees from Syria are coming in and applying to become permanent residents in Canada, and the experience of a refugee from Syria. So once somebody has been granted permanent residency, they will receive a permanent residency card. This is not a passport. A passport is only given to Canadian citizens. And there are some limitations to being a permanent resident in Canada. Permanent residents have all of the rights and freedoms as a Canadian citizen, except these 4 things. They cannot vote. So not in municipal, provincial, or federal elections, you cannot vote. So like somebody like me who is still, I've lived here for almost 20 years and I've been a permanent resident this entire time as an American citizen. I still hold a US passport. I cannot vote. I can't vote in my local election, provincial election, or federal election for any reason. You cannot run for political office. So I couldn't become mayor or run for my town council or any other political office. You cannot serve in the military. You can't be a part of any military group in Canada, even as a volunteer. And you must have what is called a Canadian citizenship sponsor. So like I said, I originally was sponsored by my spouse, and but after a certain time period, after about 15 years, then that sponsor is no longer legally responsible for you anymore. And so you then become what's called naturalized, and you're allowed to continue to remain in the country as a permanent resident for the rest of your life without a sponsor. If you've lived here and been a productive person in the society for 15 or more years. And then it also becomes much easier for someone to become a Canadian citizen if they have lived in Canada for more than 15 years. Then the application process to become a Canadian citizen is pretty quick and pretty easy. That is my situation. I am considering becoming a Canadian citizen and applying for my Canadian citizenship because I have lived here so long. It just seems that this is now my home and that it seems the right time for me to become a citizen. So below at this link, if you want to stop the video and watch, here is a story of an immigrant to Canada as she has come in from India and the experience that she has as a applicant for permanent residency in Canada. So watch this link, and after you've watched this link, it is going to ask you this question. I am asking you this question: is immigration good or bad? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? In our Zoom class discussion earlier on Thursday, I asked this question: is immigration a good thing or a bad thing for Canada? And most of the students had responded that you think it needs to be balanced, that we shouldn't just have this open immigration policy where people flood in from any country in the world in any large numbers, and that it needs to be balanced because it can create what's called a dependency load. Our carrying capacity of how many people Canada can support is actually quite large. We have a lot of land, we have a lot of resources, we have a lot of jobs, but what we don't have are a lot of people who are able to support things like social services and infrastructure through their taxes. So because our population is so low at 37 million, we need more people in the working age, between the ages of 16 years old to 64 years old. That working age group needs to be larger and able to carry the capacity of both children and elderly and immigrants coming into the country. So if Canada allows too many immigrants, that carrying capacity becomes very, very heavy, and the dependency load of people like me who are part of the working class, that would be very heavy on me, and our taxes would go up. So I want you to consider this: is immigration good or bad, or what would that balance of immigration look like? And make sure you watch this video link. So the question is, where are most immigrants settling? Where are they living here in Canada? Most immigrants are living in cities. So the largest cities across Canada we know are all located across the south, and that we have 90% of Canada's population is living on less than 10% of the land, and most of Canada's population are living in big cities. Well, that's definitely where all of the immigrants are going as well. Very few immigrants choose to settle in any of the rural areas of Canada or agricultural areas of Canada. So most are settling in the cities. And particularly, most are settling in the Greater Toronto area and Niagara region. The largest number of immigrants in Canada are coming in through the Peace Bridge in Fort Erie and the Rainbow Bridge in Niagara Falls. And if they're not coming in through a physical port of call through the bridges, they're coming in through the Toronto Pearson Airport. So the majority of people migrating into Canada are coming in through these are the three most popular ports. The fourth most popular port is Vancouver. And that is where a lot of Asian immigrants are actually coming through, is through the Western port in Vancouver. But that means that what happens is people come in through the airports, or they come in and they cross the border over bridges, and they come into Canada, and then they literally will settle in the nearest community, the nearest largest city community within their port of entry. And that's just because that's where immediate housing might be available, or services to get them settled. Jobs might be more available in these areas, and this is definitely the case for the Niagara region. We have a lot of immigrants settling in Niagara and around the Greater Toronto area, just because it's close to where people come in, and that's where the most housing and jobs are available. So where do people settle long term? In general, these are the statistics that were available to us at the moment about where people are settling. So you can see that Ontario and British Columbia have the two highest rates of population settlement of immigrants. And again, in the east, so people coming from Africa or Europe are coming in through our eastern ports through Ontario, where a lot of immigrants coming in from Asia are coming in through the British port near Vancouver. And you can see that here are the cities listed. So these are the biggest cities in Canada and how many immigrants are settling in those cities. Again, you can see the two biggest cities that settle immigrants are Toronto and Vancouver. And you can see collectively that other cities like the Niagara region, Montreal, and Calgary being the other big city areas where people are settling. And because of this, it makes these city communities very diverse. This is a picture from Toronto, where you have entire communities within the Greater Toronto area that are communities where a particular people group or culture have settled. So there's Chinatown, there's Little Italy, there's a Caribbean community. There is a huge community of different Middle Eastern groups in Northern Toronto. And so usually what happens is that immigrants come into these city areas, and then they have a tendency to want to live in and around one another, creating their own little mini cities where their culture, their language, their food, their religion, and their way of life seems to be reproduced like their home country in those little areas. So this is something that makes Toronto very diverse and very unique. There's different cultural festivals. You see pockets of communities and neighborhoods where you literally can go across the street, and you can be in Little Italy in Toronto and cross one street, a church street, and then you're in Chinatown. And it's on one side Italian and on the other side Chinese. And it's very diverse, with like these city blocks that are just like little communities that represent the cultures that are living there. So again, there's a lot of controversy around immigration in Canada, and you can stop the video here and watch this YouTube link. It's a news report that discusses kind of Canadians' perspectives on immigration. So there's positives. There are positives to immigration. It increases our population, which we need. We need to increase available number of workers, people to do jobs in Canada if we want to stimulate our economy. It adds to our cultural respect and cultural diversity in Canada, which is a good thing. And it's a lot of times we're letting in immigrants because Canada has that policy as a peace country to protect human rights and protect asylum seekers and refugees. And that's a good thing. The negatives is that dependency load for the Canadian citizens and Canadian residents who are part of the working class, the dependency load becomes heavier. We have a heavier carrying capacity, and that just, it puts a lot more tax stress on those who are actually part of the working class, because not a lot of refugees or asylum seekers are able to come in and enter the workforce quickly. Many refugees might not speak the language or have the skill sets or the money or the residency to be able to do jobs right away. And because of this, it takes time. And so who supports refugees coming into Canada in large numbers when so many cannot enter the workforce immediately? So Canada really does want to balance how many people are coming in, particularly that's why that economic class of immigrants was so much bigger. We want people coming into Canada who are able to do and enter the workforce more quickly and can become part of our economic structure more quickly. And so if our economic class shrunk and our refugee class and asylum seekers grew, that would be really hard on the country. So we don't want to see that. We want to see most of the people coming into Canada, we want to be able to get them into housing and get them into jobs as quickly as possible. It's a heavier load on our education system and a heavier load on our healthcare system. So we just want to make sure that we don't have that imbalance. There can be a lot of discrimination and issues too with culture and language clash and discrimination from those who are living here in the country, seeing immigrants coming in and assuming that they're not contributing, or assuming that they're a burden to society because they have needs around language and education or job training, or that they're putting pressure on the society. And then a lot of criticism about overpopulation of cities comes in, the Greater Toronto area being the biggest controversial area to talk about in Canada, because there's so much multiculturalism and so much diversity in Canada, but there's in Toronto and in the GTA, but there's also housing shortage. Housing has become very expensive, and there's just not enough good housing for people to come in and be able to live and work in the city areas. And so a lot of people are concerned about overpopulation and making it more expensive and too expensive to live in cities, because these areas are growing in migrant people moving into them. So this is the question I want you to consider. Should Canada be a leading country in population disbursement? Should we be a country that's saying we will help to stabilize populations around the world? We will help with refugee crises. We will allow Chinese immigrants to come in because there's overpopulation in a lot of big Chinese cities. So we will allow for Chinese citizens to come in and apply for status to come in and work and live in Canada. Is this good? Should Canada continue to help with dispersing our world populations around the world? Should we be accepting as many refugees as we can, and in what ways? Why or why not? And this video link will help you, again, to help educate and inform your opinion. And that is all for today. So just look at Edsby for your tasks for today.